faithfully conveying value by interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today, we're discussing the book called Founders, The Revolutionary War. Well, the author is Joseph Ellis, an American historian. As a senior researcher in early American history, Ellis has published many popular works. This Founders book won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2001. Oh, the founders, that is the founding fathers of the United States. They signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, a total of 56 individuals, including familiar names like Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and others. During the Revolutionary War, they united and cooperated closely, defeating the British Army and laying the foundation for America. In 1789, when the federal government was established, they became the first leaders, with Washington serving as the first U.S. president. He appointed Jefferson as Secretary of State, Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Madison was elected to Congress. With his accumulated prestige, he became a congressional leader with great influence. These figures hold a revered status among Americans, so researchers often avoid criticism, intentionally covering up their disagreements and conflicts to portray harmony. But the perspective in this founder's book is quite different. The author doesn't hide the disagreements among the founding fathers. By revealing these disagreements, Ellis presents the challenges America faced at its founding. In the following explanation, I'll clarify the founding fathers' disagreements around three key issues, and also help you understand the lasting impacts these disagreements had on American history. Let's start with the first disagreement, whether to abolish slavery or not. This is actually a historical legacy issue. During the British colonial period, plantations in the southern North America grew rapidly. To provide labor, Britain transported many enslaved Africans, accumulating over time. Southern states like Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina gathered hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who were the main labor force on plantations doing heavy work. However, their treatment was generally poor, and enlightened individuals were dissatisfied, calling for abolition. In 1776, the Revolutionary War broke out. Facing a common enemy, the 13 British colonies decided to set aside disputes to first achieve independence. After the war victory in 1787, representatives from 13 states gathered in Philadelphia to discuss drafting a constitution and establishing a federal government. At this meeting, representatives from northern states proposed explicitly ending the slave trade and abolishing slavery in the Constitution, which provoked strong backlash from Southern representatives. They stated that if this were to happen, Southern states would secede from the Union, but eventually both sides reached a compromise. Specifically, the Constitution avoided mentioning terms like slavery, slaves, or blacks altogether. Secondly, the Constitution stipulated that until 1808, Congress couldn't interfere with slavery, meaning the abolition issue had to be postponed for at least 20 years. Originally, it was thought this matter was settled, and whether to abolish slavery after 20 years would be decided later. Unexpectedly, just 3 years after the Constitution was adopted, in 1790, a delegation from Northern citizens submitted a petition to Congress demanding an end to the slave trade. At the same time, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society also submitted a petition urging Congress to abolish slavery as soon as possible. The abolitionists had two main reasons. First, slavery violates the fundamental spirit of the Declaration of Independence, which declares all men are created equal. So why should blacks be enslaved by whites if they have equal rights? Clearly, the existence of slavery is a mockery of the Declaration of Independence. Second, the Constitution does stipulate no abolition before 1808, but that doesn't mean never abolishing slavery. The Constitution's intent was actually to abolish slavery gradually. So, since abolition is inevitable, eventually, why not start discussing it now? It must be said that these two reasons are very persuasive. More importantly, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society has an unusual background. Its president was Benjamin Franklin, a beloved founding father. His personal involvement greatly increased its influence. Congress couldn't ignore it. They had to convene a meeting to discuss. Uh, at the meeting, Southern representatives exploded in anger, accusing this move of being provocative and divisive. Northern representatives countered by constantly citing the Declaration of Independence and American spirit. So, Southern representatives, why are the North and South so incompatible on the slavery issue? Differences in ideology are one thing, but more crucially, it's about different economic systems. At that time, the American South was dominated by a plantation economy, relying on enslaved Black people for labor. For example, major Southern states like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina had over 600,000 enslaved people, accounting for 87% of all enslaved individuals in the U.S. As you can imagine, for their own interests, these states stubbornly insisted on maintaining slavery. The North was different. It was just starting industrialization and needed many people who could freely sell their labor. In 1790, the U.S. population was nearly 3.9 million, with nearly 700,000 enslaved people, making up 18% of the total population. Such a massive human resource was trapped by the institution of slavery. Unable to shift this labor into industrial production, this made the North very anxious. Northern congressmen thus reached a consensus. Abolishing slavery would greatly release labor and advance America's industrialization, and different economic models caused the North-South divide. This opposition was also reflected among the founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin and Treasury Secretary Hamilton were from Pennsylvania in the North. They believed America should rapidly industrialize, so they supported the abolition movement. In this petition effort, they played the role of behind-the-scenes drivers. Meanwhile, Jefferson from Virginia, Secretary of State, and Madison, a congressional leader, worked to preserve slavery. This is really fascinating because the famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, was personally written by Jefferson. Ideologically, he didn't approve of slavery. However, in the face of interests, Jefferson compromised. Under the leadership of Jefferson and Madison, Southern congressmen found various reasons to block abolition. They claimed that freeing all enslaved people would cost up to $140 million, while the federal budget was only $7 million, making it clearly unaffordable. At the same time, Southern states submitted a report to Congress opposing the abolition proposal. This report included 7 proposals, with the most critical being the second one. It stated that whether to emancipate slaves was a state government's right, and Congress had no authority to interfere. Moreover, even after 1808, this right would still be held by state governments. Under Madison's planning, Congress passed this report, which effectively undermined the abolition effort. From then on, Northern congressmen found it difficult to push the abolition movement through Congress. This planted the seeds for the later American Civil War, because slavery couldn't be discussed within the constitutional framework. The North and South could only resolve their conflict through war. You could say Madison dug this pit. Coincidentally, just as Madison's report passed, Franklin died, and the abolition movement lost a powerful supporter. In the short term, Jefferson and Madison achieved an overwhelming victory in this confrontation, but they didn't have time to celebrate. The second disagreement was right before them: whether America should repay its debts and how. Like slavery, the debt was also a historical legacy issue. From the first shot fired at Lexington in 1775 to the signing of the peace treaty between Britain and America in Paris in 1783, The American Revolutionary War lasted 8 years and was very expensive. To fund the war over 8 years, America constantly borrowed money, taking large foreign loans from France and Spain and internally issuing bonds to borrow from the public. By the war's end, America was deeply in debt. In 1789, the federal government was established and Hamilton became Secretary of the Treasury. They calculated that America's total debt reached $77.1 million, including $11.7 million in foreign debt and $40.4 million in domestic debt. The remaining $25 million was debt owed by individual American states, a huge sum at that time. Not only was the federal government under immense pressure, but many state governments would be bankrupt if calculated by debt ratio. So some suggested since they couldn't repay anyway, why not just default? Hamilton strongly refuted this argument. He pointed out that for a government, credit is its most important asset, and it must never break its promises under any circumstances. If they defaulted, they would lose international trust from other countries and domestic trust from the people. Such a government wouldn't be far from collapse. Therefore, no matter how large the debt, they must grit their teeth and repay it, never sacrificing the nation's long-term interests for short-term gains. In 1790, Hamilton prepared a report on public credit and submitted it to Congress. In the report, he detailed America's debt situation and proposed solutions. Hamilton expected Congress to pass it smoothly and his plan to be implemented very quickly. But to his surprise, someone actually opposed this report, and that person was Madison. The relationship between Hamilton and Madison was extraordinary. The two were once close friends, where during the Constitutional Convention, along with John Jay, they wrote numerous articles arguing for the necessity of drafting a constitution and establishing a federal government. Because they both advocated for federalism, Hamilton and Madison were called Federalists. Their articles were later compiled into the Federalist Papers, which became foundational documents for the United States. This time, Hamilton's credit report was also meant to sustain the federal government. So, logically, Madison should have supported it, but unexpectedly, he took the opposing side. Why? It turned out he was dissatisfied with Hamilton's solution, and there were 2 points of dissatisfaction. First, regarding domestic debt. As mentioned earlier, during the Revolutionary War, the U.S. issued a large number of bonds, many given to soldiers as pay. The promise was that after the war, the government would redeem the bonds so veterans could have security in old age. Such things are easier said than done. Due to financial difficulties, the government kept delaying bond redemption. During this time, many veterans, needing money urgently, sold their bonds to speculators. The selling price was very low, generally only half the face value or even as little as 1/12. By 1790, most bonds were held by a few speculators, with veterans having very few. Now, the U.S. government was redeeming bonds at face value, meaning speculators who bought cheap made huge profits. And while veterans clearly suffered losses, which angered Madison, he believed veterans shed blood for independence, but got nothing. Even their rightful bond returns were snatched by speculators through unscrupulous means, utterly unfair. Therefore, Madison proposed confiscating bonds from speculators and returning them to veterans. In response, Hamilton argued veterans sold bonds voluntarily without coercion. Since it was voluntary, government confiscation would be illegal and absolutely unacceptable. Hamilton insisted the government pay only current bondholders, leaving veterans to accept their misfortune. Madison's other dissatisfaction was about state debts. Hamilton proposed that since many state governments couldn't repay their debts, the federal government should take over state debts, meaning the federal government would repay what states owed. This wasn't actually a new idea. During the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton had suggested a similar plan, and Madison had actively promoted it back then. However, times had changed by 1790, and Madison's position shifted. As a Virginia representative, Madison re-examined Hamilton's plan from the state government's perspective. He realized that the federal government repaying state debts sounded good, but was actually a trap, because this would make the federal government the creditor to state governments, allowing it to control them. This was absolutely unacceptable to Madison, driving Hamilton crazy. He couldn't understand how his former close friend had suddenly become an opponent. Actually, he didn't know Madison had someone behind him, the Secretary of State. Jefferson, like Madison, was from Virginia. He drafted the Declaration of Independence. During the Constitutional Convention, Jefferson was in France as a diplomat and couldn't attend, but he had criticisms of the newly adopted U.S. Constitution. Jefferson believed this part of the Constitution overly emphasized federal power while failing to protect state independence and people's rights. After returning home, he seized on this point and repeatedly criticized it. Under Jefferson's influence, Madison's thinking transformed from federalist to states' rights advocate. States' rights advocates believed state governments could better protect people's rights than the federal government, so states should have more independence to shield people from federal overreach. From this theory, having the federal government take over state debts meant forcing states to surrender to federal authority. This touched a nerve for states' rights advocates, who naturally opposed it fiercely. With Jefferson's support, Madison used skilled political tactics to mobilize Southern congressmen to block Hamilton's report in Congress. Seeing his plan dying before implementation, Hamilton grew desperate and suddenly thought of a lifeline. At that time, the U.S. Capitol hadn't been decided, and factions were fiercely debating it. But considering, economic strength, transportation convenience, and municipal facilities, New York was the undeniable choice. Philadelphia was also a strong contender after all. Both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were born there. Its historical status speaks for itself. But Madison wanted the capital on the Potomac River in the mid-Atlantic. Learning this, Hamilton arranged a dinner with Jefferson and Madison, where they struck a political deal. Hamilton promised to convince New York to abandon its bid for the capital, supporting Madison instead in exchange. Madison would stop obstructing Hamilton's report. On July 9, 1790, the House passed the Residence Act, mandating a new city on the Potomac River. This city became Washington, the capital. Days later, the House passed Hamilton's report, approving federal assumption of state debts. On the surface, this political trade succeeded. Both sides got what they wanted. But in reality, neither was satisfied. For Hamilton, his friendship with Madison ended. Their cooperation now relied on naked self-interest, not shared political ideals. Madison and Jefferson soon regretted it. They felt trading expanded federal power for the capital was too costly, unwise. In later years, they aggressively opposed Hamilton, trying to recoup losses. So the 1790 deal didn't heal the founding fathers' rift, it accelerated their split. They moved from cooperation to confrontation, growing fiercer. Eventually, even the revered Washington was dragged into the vortex, left exhausted. This brings me to the third event. The controversy over Jay's Treaty, which influenced early U.S. foreign policy. In November 1794, John Jay signed the Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation with Britain in London. The Jay Treaty. Jay, mentioned earlier, formed the Federalist triumvirate with Hamilton and Madison. After the federal government formed, he became Chief Justice. With diplomatic experience, he handled foreign affairs. Washington assigned him to negotiate Jay's treaty. Thus, this treaty reflected Washington's own will. During the Revolutionary War, the U.S. and Britain were bitter enemies, while France was our ally. It was with France's strong support that America managed to defeat Britain and gain independence. So the Franco-American alliance has always been the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, seen as unshakable. But Washington decided to change that. This shift was based on his observation of America's external environment. Looking at Europe's situation, after the French Revolution, France plunged into prolonged social turmoil, unable to recover. Meanwhile, Britain has been steadily developing. It's foreseeable that Britain will be the future hegemon of Europe. From an economic impactful, Britain remains America's largest trade partner, with 90% of federal government revenue coming from import taxes on British goods. It can be said that America's economic dependence on Britain far exceeds that on France. Considering all these factors, Washington believed we should decisively abandon France and actively ally with Britain. Because in politics, there are no permanent enemies or friends, only permanent interests. Looking at how the situation unfolded, Washington was highly foresighted, showcasing his exceptional judgment as a great nation's leader. But in America at the time, few could understand him. After all, Americans fought an 8-year war with Britain, a deep-seated blood feud. How could we just ally with them? Thus, Jay's Treaty faced strong opposition domestically in the U.S. Among the many opponents, Jefferson's reaction was particularly intense. As mentioned earlier, Jefferson served as a diplomat stationed in Paris, so he knew France's situation fairly well. Jefferson believed that the chaos, violence, and hopelessness during the French Revolution were merely temporary phenomena. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity proposed by the revolutionaries were absolutely correct and, given time, would be embraced by people worldwide. Conversely, Jefferson strongly disliked Britain. He thought Britain had three major flaws: monarchical despotism, state religion privileges, and court intrigue. British society was utterly corrupt and beyond redemption. Who the fledgling America should befriend? Isn't it obvious? Therefore, Jefferson was furious about Jay's Treaty being signed, as it trampled on his principles. Initially, Jefferson wanted Madison to manipulate Congress into not approving Jay's Treaty, but this failed. The reason was simple. Washington's personal prestige was at its zenith. Although many congressmen didn't understand Jay's Treaty, they were unwilling to defy Washington's will. Ultimately, Congress passed the treaty, which infuriated Jefferson. Not daring to openly criticize Washington, he spread rumors through media, launching personal attacks. Suddenly, newspapers across America were flooded with articles smearing Washington. He was called a hypocrite and traitor who sold out national interests. Washington deeply cared about his reputation, and this overwhelming slander caused him emotional pain and severely dampened his political enthusiasm. In 1796, as his second presidential term ended, Washington delivered his farewell address, announcing he wouldn't seek re-election and would retire from politics. This also declared the end of friendship between Washington and Jefferson. The end. After retirement, Washington never spoke another word to Jefferson or wrote him a letter, truly cutting ties completely. Today, people might find it strange that two lifelong friends completely severed ties over Jay's Treaty. Was it really necessary? Actually, looking deeper, Jay's Treaty was just a trigger. The roots of their split were planted earlier. As we've said, after Washington became president, he appointed Jefferson as Secretary of State and Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, one managing foreign affairs, the other the economy. Washington clearly knew they were political rivals. Why arrange it this way? Because he didn't want both sides causing chaos while pursuing their own interests. Washington intended to mediate, bridge their differences, and ensure the fledgling United States developed stably. Washington's idea was good, but implementation proved very difficult. Because Hamilton and Jefferson's disagreements weren't just about specific issues. Their governing philosophies had profound differences. Hamilton advocated elite rule, concentrating capital in few elites' hands to revitalize the economy through them. What role should government play in this? Hamilton believed government should create comprehensive economic plans, provide financial support and property protection for elites, and vigorously promote industrial and commercial development. To achieve this, some centralization was needed, concentrating power in the federal government, as the saying goes, pooling resources for major undertakings. This was completely opposed to Jefferson's philosophy. Jefferson believed that entrusting power and capital to elites would harm people's freedom and interests, ultimately turning the federal government into a dictatorship manipulated by a few, betraying the spirit of the Revolutionary War. Because Americans rebelled precisely against British tyranny. So, in Jefferson's view, Hamilton was a traitor to the Revolution and a spokesman for authoritarian regimes and big capital. Hamilton equally despised Jefferson, seeing him as a pompous talker filled with unrealistic fantasies, utterly unreasonable. Behind both men stood different political forces that maximized their interests by backing their respective spokesmen. So, Washington saw the situation clearly. He realized that if Hamilton and Jefferson openly split, their political factions would escalate conflicts, threatening America's unity and stability. So, Washington tried to remain neutral and balance their relationship. And the problem was that deep down, Washington actually agreed with Hamilton. Even while maintaining neutrality, this affinity unconsciously surfaced. For example, regarding the two issues mentioned earlier, abolishing slavery and federal takeover of state debts, Washington subtly expressed support. He backed Hamilton's National Bank, too. In return, Hamilton supported Washington on Jay's Treaty, making Jefferson feel Washington and Hamilton were allies while he was suppressed. Thus, in 1793, after Washington's reelection, Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State. With Madison, he formed the Democratic-Republican Party to block Hamilton's policies in Congress. Hamilton founded the Federalist Party to counter them, marking the start of American party politics. Their factions openly split. Washington's plan failed. Combined with the Jay Treaty controversy, he became disillusioned and fully retired from politics. In 1801, Jefferson defeated Adams, whom Hamilton supported, to become U.S. president. From then on, the tide turned. Democratic Republicans gained absolute dominance over Federalists. Over the next 2 decades, Democratic Republican candidates were continuously elected as U.S. presidents, while the Federalist Party gradually disintegrated and vanished into history. Here concludes the story of the Founding Fathers' disagreements and struggles. So, what impact did these disagreements have on America's political ecosystem? First, let's discuss the positive legacies. First, despite their conflicts, neither Jefferson nor Hamilton resorted to violence, a stark contrast to the French Revolution, where disagreements often turned bloody. In over 2 centuries of American history, except for the Civil War, all other conflicts have been resolved peacefully. Second, the rivalry between Federalists and Democratic Republicans established the foundation of the two-party system. Today's Democratic Party originated from Jefferson's Democratic-Republicans, while the Republican Party evolved from Hamilton's Federalists, establishing a tradition of alternating power. Third, Washington stepped down after 2 terms, establishing another tradition. U.S. presidents served maximum 2 terms. Only Roosevelt exceeded this during 2Y well. Now let's examine negative impacts. First, it pioneered political horse trading. To pass federal assumption of state debts, Hamilton traded with Madison for the capital location, a backroom deal soon mastered by politicians, creating political brokers. Anyone who watched House of Cards will remember the character Remy Danton. He's a political broker who profits by connecting parties and interest groups, fertile ground for corruption. Second, it worsened political culture. Jefferson's media smear campaign against Washington was quickly adopted and intensified by politicians. Mark Twain's short story, Running for Governor, shows how, by the late 1800s, spreading rumors to manipulate elections became standard practice. These negative consequences were clearly unforeseen by the founding fathers. Yet history is history. It cannot be rewritten. Well, that concludes Founders. Reading notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.